Hello everybody, good evening and a very warm welcome to Skeptics in the Pub online. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we're a collaboration of people from Skeptics in the Pub groups from all over the country. We've got together because of the lockdown to put on weekly talks. So our speakers come from a wide variety of backgrounds, but what they have in common is that they approach their subject from a rational, evidence-based point of view. So it's really good to see that there's a lot of you already in the chat, socialising just like you're at the bar before a Skeptics in the Pub talk. The plan for this evening is that our speaker will talk for about 45 minutes. We'll then have a short break followed by a Q&A. Q&A usually lasts for about half an hour, and these timings are approximate. You can post questions for the speaker. Our moderators will be putting links in the chat of how to do that. And they'll also be posting some other links. For example, our speaker has written a book recently, or he's written a number of books, but his most recent book we'll put in the chat. And we'll also put some links to show you how to donate via PayPal if you want to contribute to our running costs. So I mentioned that we've got a number of varied speakers. Next week, we've got Nick Brown, who's going to be talking to us on how to spot science that doesn't add up. And the following week, we've got Angela Russell, who'll be telling us about the neuroscience of sexual arousal and desire. So as I said, pretty varied, and they're going to be very interesting. But perhaps even more interesting, and that's tonight, we've got Chris Goodall come to talk to us. He is an author and a businessman. He's written a number of books about energy futures, energy transitions, and building a low-carbon world. He also puts his money where his mouth is and invests in clean technology. So tonight, he'll be talking to us about how the UK can get to zero carbon. So I'd like a really warm welcome, please, from everybody for Chris Goodall.
Thank you, Cleo. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you very much indeed, Skeptics in the Pub, for inviting me. The first contact was from the Bristol Skeptics, but I've seen a lot of different parts of the Skeptic universe as we've prepared for this talk. Thank you very much indeed for asking me along. I'm going to talk for no more than 45 minutes. Perhaps it will be less, depending on how fast things go. And I hope we can have a decent and provocative session of questions afterwards, similar to what we would have in the pub. I did a talk for the Lewis Skeptics in the Pub a few years ago, and it was pretty rambunctious from beginning to end, and a lot of fun, I hope, certainly for me. This is the book that I published in in February of this year. What we need to do now. It's a plan for how the UK might move towards a zero carbon world in 10, 20, 30 years' time. We promised to do so as a society by 2030. It can be done quicker if we're going to keep temperature increases down to around 1.5 or thereabouts degrees of increase over pre-industrial levels. April was the warmest month, was the warmest April ever, and the problems of climate change are getting more obvious, more dramatic every day. The book is a simple book and with a bit of science in, but mostly it's aiming at a general audience to identify a route to net zero across the UK economy and society. It's not just about the way we run our economy, it's also about how we run our society, our consumptions, the things we do to entertain, look after ourselves. The second portion of the book, the second important objective in the book, is to try to identify ways in which the move to a zero carbon economy, that is to say, one with no net emissions to the atmosphere of greenhouse gases, often called net zero, the effect of that move is positive in financial and social terms for the less well-off members of British society. Overall, what I'm trying to do in the book is provide a sense that it is possible to 100% decarbonise Britain, and therefore also probably other parts of the world, but there are lots of things about Britain which are highly specific. And second, that it's advantageous. It's going to be costly in the short term, but in the long term, the advantages of moving to a low-carbon economy are enormous. The obvious ones, such as reduced pollution, for example, in cities, are more transparent today than they've ever been before because of the crisis over the virus. But generally, there are lots of ways in which the move away from a coal, oil, and gas-based economy is of benefit to all of us, even though, as I say, there is going to be some short-term pain. Let's look a bit at the background, if I may. So far, the UK has focused almost entirely on reducing the amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases that come from the generation of electricity. Electricity generation is the easiest way of, is the easiest area to decarbonize. There's no question about that. That's true pretty much around the world. And the UK has done rather well at it, it has to be said, particularly by the comparison with other industrial economies. But it's not just electricity generation that we need to decarbonize. We need to decarbonize agriculture, aviation, livestock, heavy industry, heavy transport, clothing, building insulation, cement, forestry, insulation of homes, long-distance shipping, and steel. Those are the main things we need to work on. Each one of them represents an extraordinarily difficult challenge in some senses, and in the book I try to identify a way in which it might be possible within 20 to 30 years to remove all sources of greenhouse gases coming from the most important areas of our greenhouse gas emissions today. Let's look at the pattern over the last 30 years of the way greenhouse gases have evolved coming out of the UK economy. I should stress these numbers aren't necessarily particularly accurate, and they do omit the embedded carbon that comes into our country from things that are made elsewhere, whether it be computers in China, diamonds from Africa, or food from France. The top line is the total greenhouse gas emissions, which includes both carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, important ones such as nitrous oxide and methane. Nitrous oxide and methane largely come from agriculture and from agriculture-related activities. CO2 largely comes from the burning of fossil fuels. In the period from 1990, we've cut output of fossil fuels from 800 million tonnes or thereabouts to around 450 million tonnes in 2017, and that fall is probably continued since then, although the numbers are still preliminary. Much of that reduction has come from the fact that we've been very good at getting rid of emissions from electricity generation, as I hinted earlier. They were at around to almost 300 million tonnes. That's now in 2017 at the right-hand side of this chart. It had fallen to about 100 million tonnes, 40% roughly of where it was 25, 30 years ago. Today, this year, it's going to be even lower than that. We've moved further away from coal. We've moved more towards renewables, particularly as we've seen a major reduction in the use of electricity over the past 2 or 3 months, about 20% reduction. A very different pattern if we look at transport, which was much less important as a source of greenhouse emissions in 1990 and actually is now more important than electricity generation. It's barely changed, and in fact, in the last few years, it's tended to shift upwards. It's done so because we've moved away from fuel-efficient diesel to petrol. I'm not saying that there's no reason to keep with your diesel car. Clearly, it's a lot of problems involved in diesel, but they are more fuel efficient than petrol cars. But at the same time, we've increased the weight of our average of the cars on the marketplaces. They've been we've moved towards SUVs and other types of larger vehicles. So there's a particular problem. How do we decarbonize the production? How do our needs for personal transport? Now, moving on to a little area which I wanted to illustrate as a way of talking about the remaining problem with electricity generation. These figures here on this screen are from a website called Electricity Insights, which is a very useful website if anybody's interested. It's produced by Drax, the large power station in Yorkshire, which now predominantly uses biomass as its source of fuel. What this shows is the composition of electricity generation over a period just before Easter to just after Easter. This was a windy period. It was often quite sunny, and often wind plus sun plus nuclear formed a very large production in the UK. The national grid had to wind down wind production in order to make sure that there was no overproduction of electricity, which you can't have in a well-regulated electricity system. Some of the time in our electricity generation, We have a lot of solar, we have a lot of wind, and we have nuclear and biomass and other low carbon sources such as hydro. Some of the time we have none of that, or very little of it. Nuclear is fairly reliable, but not completely reliable by any means. But solar and wind obviously vary from close to zero, or zero in the case of solar, to a very large amount. And what the government has tended to do is to say, well, we can't really expand electricity generation from renewables very much from where we are at the moment, because we're all up at points where we can't use the electricity that's being generated by offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar and other electricity. This is going to be a typical pattern as we move into the future. Let's assume that today's electricity consumption stays low for a few months more. There will be periods when we have too much electricity generation. And the first part of my book looks at what we need to do about it. Now, I make the suggestion in the book that we need to move away from the government's current philosophy of how we deal with surpluses or deficits of electricity generation from renewables. Very roughly, if I can overcharacterize this, on this slide, what the government is saying to us is that we should do is when we have very little renewables, that's day one on the left-hand side of this chart, we make up the rest of our electricity demand by using gas-fired power stations and capturing the carbon dioxide that's coming off those power stations through a process called CCS, carbon capture and storage, separating out the CO2 and piping it to somewhere where it's stored, probably underground, such as in a disused North Sea oil field. The wind rises during the period between day one and day two, and renewables increase, and the gas is throttled back. That therefore acts as a complement to renewables. And at all times, therefore, in planning of the Committee on Climate Change, the government's principal advisors, there is an assumption that we're going to have no coal on our system, but a lot of remaining gas, which will mostly sit idle, but will be available if renewables aren't there to give us the electricity we need. I don't think this is the right solution. And for a few slides, I'm going to talk about what I think would be the right way of doing it, alternative to that. Now, you'll notice that, that in the standard view of what we need to do about renewables to complement with gas, we still have carbon dioxide being manufactured. We're just storing it and keeping it underground. But the problem with CCS, all of the carbon dioxide in that process. We might capture, if we're lucky, 85%. But also it adds a lot of energy use to the electricity system, so it's expensive. Now, what we've seen over the last few years is that renewables in the UK, and very much so elsewhere as well, have become the cheapest way of generating electricity. The only reason we have for not using renewables for all our electricity consumption, and indeed a much wider energy consumption as well, is because of this problem of intermittency. That is to say, we can't rely on the amount of renewable energy we're going to get at 12 o'clock tomorrow. And therefore, we have to have lots of surplus available from fossil fuel sources. But we need to change this approach. Renewables are becoming so cheap that they of our entire energy system. So in the book, with a few numbers to back it up, to build 20 times as much renewable capacity in the UK as we have at the moment. That means offshore wind, solar, and a few other things as well. Now, the big advantage of this is it gets rid of almost all the problem of intermittency, because we have so much electricity generating capacity that even on a very, very quiet day with no sun, we've still got generally enough to meet our needs, including needs that are going to arise from the switch to electric vehicles and the use of heat pumps for domestic heating. Those two are going to add to electricity demand. In the case of EVs, probably about a third of current demand is going to be added by EVs. And heat pumps, well, that depends on how many we install, but probably we're going to double electricity use over the next few years to heat our homes using electricity. Now, the key thing here is the third point on this slide. We're going to have a lot of electricity still left over. What are we going to do with that? How can we use it productively to form the basis of the rest of our economy, the energy needs for the rest of our economy. Not just electricity, but all the other things that we need energy for. And that is to store most of the surplus in the form of hydrogen. Simple to do in some senses. Pretty much everybody in this audience probably did electrolysis when they were about 50, looked at electrolysis, the creation of hydrogen from water, when they were doing GCSE chemistry. By passing a current through water under appropriate conditions, you get oxygen forming at one cathode and at one electrode, and hydrogen at the other. You can collect that hydrogen and you can store it, and you can use it for a wide variety of different things. Almost all of the things that we want to decarbonize in the rest of the economy can be decarbonized using hydrogen. We can move from carbon-based fuels to hydrogen. The electricity, the surplus electricity from that enormous oversupply of renewables is put into the electrolyzer. Hydrogen comes out. It's a simple process. It's reliable. It's highly reactive. That's to say, we've got a temporary surplus of electricity. We can generate hydrogen very quickly in a matter of seconds from it. Now, that hydrogen can then be used to provide electricity when there isn't enough renewables to go around through something called a fuel cell, or indeed combustion, if we could run conventional power stations using hydrogen. We can use it to replace natural gas for heating. Hydrogen is a substitute potentially for natural gas in domestic heating systems, in office heating systems, and in industry as well. The third thing that hydrogen can do is it can provide the key ingredient for synthetic fuels, substitutes for existing fossil fuels, such as diesel, kerosene, that we can make using low carbon sources. We'll talk a bit about that later, but this is absolutely critical, in my view, to the energy transition. We cannot, for example, decarbonize aviation using electricity. We will not be able to do long distance flying with batteries, heavy batteries, sitting in the aircraft. Very short distances, yes, possibly 20 years' time. But no, sectors like aviation are going to continue to use liquid fuels that have the characteristics of oil. We need to make sure that there's no net carbon dioxide created in their production. This is very roughly what a modern electrolyzer looks like. It sits generally, it's varying, it's developing, it's an industry that's growing incredibly fast at the moment, probably tenfold in the next 2 or 3 years, and then another tenfold after that in the next 2 or 3 years after that. As all of a sudden, around the world, people get to realize that hydrogen is probably the single most important remaining ingredient in the energy transition. We know we've got cheap renewables. Hydrogen is the way we use them effectively to create an entirely low-carbon economy. So this sits in a conventional shipping container. That's probably 1 megawatts capacity. We need hundreds of thousands of times that. But although the technology's got still a long way to go, there's a lot of cost reductions available to us. It's already making hydrogen production competitive in certain circumstances against conventional sources of hydrogen. Where is this happening? Where is this process beginning to happen that I've been talking about? The use of excess electricity to make hydrogen that fulfills the needs for other energy activities in our economy. Well, it sits on the top edge of Scotland. The islands of Orkney are some of the world leaders in beginning to use hydrogen as a way of getting rid of surpluses. The Orkneys don't have good electricity connections to the UK mainland. They can't export that much when they have too much electricity for their own users. In fact, I've been told by the people in Orkney that only approximately 50% of the electricity generated by wind turbines and by tidal generators in Orkney is actually used at the moment. So they're beginning to convert it into hydrogen. They're using that hydrogen for running vehicles, fuel cell vehicles around the islands, for powering a school on an island, the heating system of a school, for running the electricity supply to the port, and so on. This is one of the most interesting and innovative places in the world. We need to follow it very carefully. On a much larger scale, we've just seen plans in the UK to start using the electricity generated from offshore wind. This is going to be a new offshore wind farm. I think it's called Hornsea 2, if I remember correctly, where a portion of the output from this wind farm is coming onshore. It's going to be put into an electrolyzer where hydrogen is going to be generated, and then it's going to be fed in to fulfill the hydrogen needs of the Immingham Phillips 66 oil refinery on the north east coast of the UK. This hasn't happened yet, it's planned, but one of the most interesting features of the last 2 or 3 months has been the large number of oil majors, the large oil companies around the world that are beginning to see that they can run their refineries, which need a lot of hydrogen to be to produce the things that are currently produced in those refineries. They can do it using very low carbon sources through electrolysis, and it's now, in some places, the cheapest way of making hydrogen. Not everywhere, but probably it is now in the North Sea, as the costs of producing electricity there come down. And when we have a surplus of electricity, this is the best way to use it. I make that hypothesis in the book. Right, well, let's talk a little bit about the problems of expanding our renewable electricity production by 20-fold over the course of, let's say, the next 15 to 20 years. The obvious place to go is offshore into the North Sea, as the price of electricity coming off onshore wind farms has declined so sharply and will probably continue to go down. But we need to be more sophisticated than that. It's not just a question of plonking some more wind farms down, although that's happening very successfully at the moment. It's thinking about how we run an integrated European electricity system that enables wind farms to perform the matching function. That if one economy is short of electricity, the wind from one wind farm, perhaps not in that region, can be directed to serving its needs. And the whole idea here is to put into the North Sea a network of man-made islands, huge things, kilometers in circumference, that enable us to bring electricity in from wind farms around that hub, and then export it to the place that needs it most through interconnectors, ways of shipping electricity from one place to another. The countries around the North Sea, in my view, need to get together to run these hubs, both to decrease the price of generating electricity, but also to enable us to have the most flexibility in how we use that electricity, delivering it to the places that are needed when it is needed on a second-by-second basis. These plans come from the Dutch grid operator, TenneT, which is pushing this as hard as it can. But the UK has over 50% of the wind generating capacity in the UK, in the North Sea. We can run many hundreds of gigawatts of capacity. That, in other words, many times what our conventional use of electricity is, through building offshore wind combined with these wind hubs in the North Sea. And we can do the same to a large extent with solar. We have a lot of land that has very little use for it, but where we can put solar. Solar now is economic in many parts of the country, particularly the southwest, without any form of subsidy. Offshore, onshore wind, similarly, across most of the west coast of the UK, produces electricity at prices which are well below prices that might be charged by a gas-fired power station. Right. In the book, I also talk about one very important thing which I think needs to be changed. We need to municipalize the generation and distribution of electricity and other utilities. And I talk in the book about the important examples that are provided by the German Stadtwerken, the locally owned and operated businesses which run the electricity and gas supply, the water supply, the broadband, sometimes the mobile networks of the citizens who live in those areas. The biggest is the Munich City Utility, and this is the front page of their website. And as you can see at the bottom, at the top, it deals with both gas, Erdgas, Strom, electricity, Wasser, water, and so on and so forth. It makes a profit, it employs thousands of people, and it's increasingly reliant upon renewable electricity that it generates itself. Not always in the Munich area. It's talking about building a wind farm in Norway, for example, but its aim is to become both a highly competitive provider of electricity and other services to the inhabitants of the Munich area, but also to make a profit and to make sure that every single kilowatt hour of electricity in the Munich area is generated from renewable sources. One of the big problems we have in the UK is the leech-like effect of the distribution operators, the people who control the distribution of electricity to our homes. Not so much National Grid, which just manages the large networks, the very high voltage networks, but the distribution operators, most of whom are owned by private equity funds abroad, whose only intent is to get as much money out of the system as possible. We need to change that dramatically so that these entities, the municipal electricity and utility companies, become part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem. And there's quite a lot in the book about that. I've asserted that we could, in theory, transfer from natural gas to hydrogen for use in our homes for heating. This is not necessarily to be recommended, not because of safety or anything like that, but hydrogen will always tend to be quite expensive because there are some energy costs in creating it. However, we can probably deal with that. It would be better to convert houses to using heat pumps, which are an electric way of generating cost-competitive heating. However, because of the very poor state of insulation of most British houses, this may not work in a lot of places, and therefore hydrogen boilers may be necessary as part of our solution for 100% decarbonisation. Worcester Bosch made this. This is a hydrogen central heating boiler. It can be switched between hydrogen and natural gas. It costs around the same, certainly not significantly more than an existing boiler. And as you can see, it looks the same and will operate in the same space. So we can begin to think about transferring our heating needs to hydrogen. Remember, in the days of town gas, before the arrival of gas from the North Sea, we're talking about the mid-1960s here or before, our gas system was about 50% hydrogen combined with carbon monoxide, a very much more dangerous system than we would have if we just had pure hydrogen. This isn't possible yet. We need to completely get rid of all metal in the piping systems, in the large distribution networks for gas, but that should happen by the end of this decade. We can transfer to hydrogen for heating. And heating our homes and running our homes is roughly 25% of total emissions. This is a very important transition to make. Right, I want to talk a little bit, if I may, about also how we're going to use hydrogen to make synthetic fuels. In order to make fuels without using biomass or any other form of source of energy, we need hydrogen, as I've said, and we also need to collect carbon dioxide, probably from the air, but also possibly from industrial processes such as the making of cement. Once we've got hydrogen and CO2 collected directly from the air, with a bit of amendment to the CO2 to turn it into carbon monoxide, not that difficult, we can put hydrogen and CO, carbon monoxide, into a conventional chemical engineering process called Fischer-Tropsch, been around for 100 years or so, and turn that into things such as plastics, aviation, kerosene, or indeed petrol or equivalent for that. So we're moving on now to saying, well, I've suggested hydrogen to be used for generating of electricity. It can be used for the generation of heat in homes. Here, I'm suggest that hydrogen can also be used for the generating of petrochemicals, which are potentially have no net carbon impact at all. Collecting CO2 from the air is early stage. This is a plant just outside Zurich which pulls CO2, which is a tiny fraction of the total atmosphere, 400 or so parts per million. In other words, virtually not there, even with today's climate change problems. This pulls the CO2 out of the air it passes across those big fans that you can, there are 3 big rows of fans, collects it on a chemical which bonds with CO2. That chemical is taken away, heated slightly, and the CO2 is driven off. The CO2 is then, by the way, piped to what you can see probably just about in the background, which is an enormous industrial scale greenhouse. Plants like CO2, they grow better with more CO2 in the greenhouse, so that CO2 collected from the atmosphere is being captured by plants. Lots of experiments of this sort around the world. It's all early stage, but it is possible. There's no question about it. The only problem is the cost. It would be quite expensive to collect CO2 at the moment, but there's every reason to believe that that can be brought down to the cost of what it is approximately at the moment. If you buy a can of Coke, it's had CO2 injected into it. That costs Coca-Cola probably £50–80 a tonne. We should be able to collect CO2 from the air at roughly the same price. The key thing is getting the price of electricity and other energy down, because that's what dominates the cost of collecting CO2. But once we've got CO2 and hydrogen, we can replicate all parts of the modern economy that currently use fossil fuels. But we can do so without any net addition of CO2 to the atmosphere. We can also use hydrogen to make things like ammonia and fertilizers. Fertilizers, probably 1–3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Here is the first attempt to use green hydrogen, that's hydrogen made from renewable electricity, such as we've described through electrolyzers, in a fertilizer plant in Pilbara, in the northwest of Australia, one of the sunniest and windiest places in the world, almost perfect conditions for making hydrogen. And here, Yara, a big fertilizer manufacturer on a global scale, is installing the capacity to use hydrogen. What I'm trying to suggest in these slides is that with renewable electricity plus hydrogen, we have solved most of the problems of the energy portion of climate change. We can do the same thing with hydrogen in making steel. Currently, steel is probably 3–5% of world emissions because it uses a lot of coal, which is burnt, emitting CO2 to the atmosphere as the process of reducing iron ore to molten iron. This is trying to do it in a different way, using hydrogen for capturing the oxygen from iron oxide to make eventually to make steel. Once again, this is the first of what will have to be a massive number of transitions away, but every single major steel manufacturer in the world is now committed to moving away from the coal. They know its future is limited. It's going to add some cost, but I don't think it's going to add an enormous amount. And this company, SSAB in northern Sweden, one of the biggest producers of very high quality steel, says that it will be cost competitive by 2025. Here is a final example. Here is a pilot plant at a university in Germany, in Karlsruhe, which collects CO2 from the atmosphere. That's where the CO2 is collected here. Combines it with hydrogen that's been generated from electrolysis and renewable electricity, and puts it through that Fischer-Tropsch process of combining hydrogen and carbon atoms to make hydrocarbons. And what comes out of this is a replacement for diesel. Once again, I'll stress this is early stage. This is not going to be cheap technology, but it's clear that we have a route to do this. And I don't think personally there's any other obvious way in which it could be done. The most difficult to decarbonize sector is probably cement. When cement is made, calcium carbonates are heated and CO2 is driven off in that process. We can't have cement without that. There are substitutes for cement, there are different ways of making it, but this is a really difficult challenge. And what we may have to do here is simply collect the CO2 and then use it as the source of the carbon that we use in that Fischer-Tropsch process to make our kerosene, our petrol, our diesel, our aviation fuel, or whatever. So that's the energy section. I'd now like to move, if I may, on to the other things we need to decarbonize. Energy is about 2/3 of the problem in one form or another. This is 25% of the problem, very approximately, agriculture. Inside agriculture, the single most important thing is livestock. And of that, cattle are 2/3 of the problem. Sheep also very problematic because the digestion systems of ruminant animals inevitably emit methane. We may be able to manage that methane by changing the food or drugging the animals in one form or another, but in the end we're going to have methane coming out of cattle. Methane is a powerful global warming gas, and if we are going to completely decarbonize, we have to find ways of substituting for cattle. Probably, I think, we're going to decide that we're going to stop industrial manufacture of meat. through cattle farms, through feedlots, and for the other ways in which we generate our beef and our sheep meat. We can do that, we can do that by creating artificial meats. That's beginning to happen on some scale in the United States. Or we can decide that we want to move away from eating meat as a society. And there are clear trends in that direction across almost all Western societies. Probably it's most apparent so far in Israel and in France, where large segments of younger people are now adopting vegan diets. It's not just enough to move, however, away from the use of livestock, particularly industrial-scale livestock. We also need to change our ways of building our cereals. Cereals are always going to be a very important part of our diet, both from nutritional and from calorific viewpoints. There's not particularly good photographs here, but this is one of the most innovative farmers in the world. This is John Letts, farming his small holding, probably in Oxfordshire. He's driving that dreadful old combine harvester through a field of heritage wheat and other grains, rye, spelts, etc., that probably hadn't been farmed productively for 100 and 200 years. The grain is up to 2 meters high. The reason this works is that he doesn't need to use any pesticides. He doesn't use any fertilizers, and neither does he need herbicides, because the grain grows sufficiently fast to strangle almost all the weeds in it. It's also, on the right-hand side, this mixture of heritage grains, resilient to drought. So we have here potentially a way of replacing industrial grain monoculture with a completely different way of growing cereals. Now, you say, but the yield will be vastly lower than what we can get off an East Anglian monoculture. Well, what John Letts is showing to us is that that's not necessarily the case. He's giving us yields which, over a 10-year period, are as good as you can get on industrial agricultural monocultures, where one field of wheat is heavily fertilized, it needs enormous amounts of herbicide and pesticides occasionally, depending on. The great advantage of this mixture of grain is that it's pretty resilient to pests, because there's only probably 50 different types of grain in here. The pest may consume one, but the rest, the other 49, will remain untouched. This is something we really do need to be looking at, both from the maintenance of soil quality point of view, the avoidance of use of pesticides. All these are good things. But the important thing is it doesn't need any fertilizer to go in it. Properly managed, we can run this as a system without needing to make industrial fertilizers. So it's pretty close to zero carbon. Better than conventional agriculture, organic agriculture, which is reliant upon the manure from the animals which cause that methane in the first place, particularly the cows. That was food, very brief introduction. We also need to worry about clothing. Clothing, probably 4 or 5% of total emissions, and also represents, around the world, enormous problems of pollution and overuse of natural water sources. One potential way forward here, it's available now. You can buy these garments widely on the internet tonight, is to use a fabric called tencel, which is made from cellulose. What it does, cellulose is made from trees. That is quite a complex process, but it produces a fabric that's more long-lasting and has a potentially very much lower environmental footprint, including its greenhouse gas footprint. We need to decarbonize travel, of course. We are beginning to see the arrival of electric cars on the left-hand side, not here yet, probably in the UK by the end of the year. That's the Volkswagen ID3, which will be roughly the same price as the Golf, to which it is very similar. But it's not just small vehicles. We can now decarbonize. We can now produce electric vehicles up to 20 tons. That's a 10-ton vehicle, a Mercedes 10-ton vehicle, entirely powered by electricity on the side. It would be more expensive at the moment, but the running and maintenance costs are vastly lower. That's not enough. We need to have fewer cars on the roads for carbon reasons, but obviously increasingly we realize for other reasons as well, as we've seen over the past 2 or 3 months. We need to look in the UK at the example of other cities around Europe that have made dramatic improvements in pollution and in the standards of living of the people who live in those countries by adopting car-free zones and by replacing cars and transport more generally with bicycles. On the left-hand side, that's the part of the Utrecht railway station bicycle store. Utrecht is a town of about 300,000 people in Holland. There are 35,000 bicycle places around the Utrecht railway station, like the one you can see. You walk in, it's comfortable, it's well lit, it's secure, and you can leave your bike there. On the right, Pontevedra, which was one of the first towns to go for an entirely car-free city centre. Most cities around Europe are now looking at this. We're beginning even to explore it in the UK with our devotion to the use of private automobiles. Even we are beginning to think it might be a good idea to have car-free areas. The great advantage of this is it pulls economic activity back into the centre of towns, something we absolutely need to do. It is absolutely wrong. We can be totally sure of this. It is wrong to assume that cars are necessary to the prosperity of inner cities. No, the answer is cars are a disaster for them, for both from a social point of view, but also from an economic point of view for the prosperity of our cities. We can also use electricity for ships. That's on the left-hand side. Excuse me. That is a ferry which travels, I think, about 40 kilometers between two Danish islands. That's entirely run by electricity. For larger ships, we're almost certainly, in my view, either going to move to hydrogen as the propulsion energy, or to use ammonia, which is very largely made from hydrogen and from nitrogen. So it's a hydrogen derivative. I'm trying to show here that for most things, we can move to a hydrogen-based economy if we can't electrify it. We can't make electric planes, and we never will be able to do so in all probability. We've therefore got to decide whether we want to fly so much, but urgently we need to find ways of creating synthetic aviation fuels which can replace the high carbon that we're using at the moment. But remember that when flying, it's not just the CO2. The effect of flying and delivering CO2 and water vapor to the high atmosphere is far worse than it would be at the surface. It's probably about twice as bad. So we need to think about whether the world should be flying as much or whether we can ratchet back aviation. Even if we can generate low carbon fuels to do that aviation, it's probably better that we don't do it at all, or we do it to the minimal extent. One of the big challenges that the UK faces in particular, and I'm aware that I've probably only got 2 or 3 more minutes, so I shall race through this if I may, is the very poor quality of our housing stock from an insulation point of view. About a quarter of houses in Britain were built before 1914. They're almost all very badly insulated. They use a lot of energy. That costs money, and at the moment is producing CO2 in vast quantities. As I say, roughly 25% of our total CO2 emissions coming from houses. This is the most interesting experiment we're seeing in the UK at the moment, the use of a Dutch technology called energy sprong. Here, 7 houses in Nottingham converted. 2 houses weren't, you can see, because they're in private ownership. They declined this opportunity. The others 7 are social housing. Dramatic reduction by pinning panels to the outside of the walls, by putting solar panels on the top, by refurbishing inside. The bills for these houses, which were for heating alone £1,500 a year in one case, have now declined to about 1/10 of that, and they can eventually become zero carbon. We also need to build houses. It's not as important as refurbishing old houses, but we need to work on building houses which have zero net carbon embedded in them. It's not just operating a house that causes energy loss. It's building it in the first place with the concrete and the other things we need to use. But we can replace our new housing with, instead of masonry and concrete, we need to base it around wood. That's the way it happens in most parts of the world. We've got this strange affliction that we think that only houses made out of brick can possibly work. No, we can create housing that uses predominantly wood, and that's both better for the carbon dioxide embedded in them and much easier to insulate. Moving on. One of the things we need to address to help pull CO2 out of the air is the very low level of forestry in the UK. This illustrates it in the 5 biggest European countries, the average forestry level is about 35%, including Germany, France, Spain, and Italy. In the UK, it's 13%. By pushing that back up to 35%, probably by giving over land that's currently used for very low value pasture, we have a chance to significantly cut our emissions, to pull back CO2 from the atmosphere. This is an illustration of how much we can do, how much we can make from wood compared to the sheep meat that would be replaced on the same land. And it also will save us money. Subsidies for sheep farmers cost about £1 billion for the UK at the moment, and that's not going to go away. We're also the second biggest importer of wood products in the world after China, the second biggest in the world. We bring in £8 billion. Much of that could be replaced if we decided to shift from very low value sheep cultivation to the cultivation of wood and wood products. I'll just dash straight over this. It's about carbon taxes. I believe there's a very strong argument for carbon taxing because that makes hydrogen and all the things that come off it competitive very quickly. It doesn't have to be a particularly high carbon tax. It might be as high, might be only 2 or 3 times what the current EU carbon tax is operating at. But that's enough now that things are getting cheaper to push big companies towards using low carbon alternatives when they can. Right, I'm talking about other ways of capturing carbon from the air. I'm just going to stop. This is the last slide, if I may. I haven't talked about this extensively, but I did want to make the point that this transition can be good for social equality in the UK. Better insulated homes, improving, therefore, the lives and the health of people across the UK. Better public transport by pushing cars out and prioritising public transport. Lowered pollution, including noise. Many of us have benefited enormously from that over the last 2 months. Better food, moving away from industrial agriculture and manufacture of very low quality food, which are based around meat of low quality itself. Providing more jobs in renewables. Offshore wind could be is a major sector. We have the resources to make it the source of employment, very high quality employment across much of the UK. We can build jobs in forestry and wood products, and by building a circular economy, particularly around second-hand clothes, second-hand electronics and things like that, where we're beginning to make progress, but it's a very long way to go. We give more employment, locally based, municipally based. And that's the last point, local control over energy. That's a good way of bringing back employment and income to the cities and towns that have been sucked dry by the globalization of energy supply. And also, lastly, to provide a dividend from the carbon tax, which disproportionately benefits the less well-off in society. Thank you very much. That's the book, and I hope you get a chance to read it at some stage.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. That was really, really interesting. Starting back at Drax Power Station, which I remember from a A-level field trip, coming right up to date and then into the future. Things that I certainly hadn't thought of, and I imagine there's a lot there that most of our listeners hadn't thought of either. I think that's proved by the number of questions we've got on Slido. Can I suggest that during the break, people head on over to Slido, have a look at the questions and upvote the ones that you're interested in? There's no way we're going to get through all of them. And I think if you can tell us what you're most interested in hearing Chris answer, then we'll make sure that we ask him those questions. So we're going to have a break now for, what time is it? It's about 15 minutes. We'll start again at 8:05, giving you time to go out and join the clap. So another round of applause, please, for Chris. Thank you so much. That was such a good talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Claire.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you've got your drinks now, and I imagine the queue at the bar wasn't very long. There's always a benefit to everything. We have got a lot of really, really interesting questions here. So what we're going to do is work through the most upvoted ones and see how much time we've got. So once again, Chris, thank you so much for your talk. It was really, really interesting, as evidenced by the number of questions we've got. The first question here comes from Anonymous. If people don't put their names on, then even if there's no way of knowing who they are. But the first question is, do you encounter many climate change deniers? If yes, how do you engage with them?
I don't encounter anymore anybody who doubts the existence of climate change. I do encounter people who think that the problems of climate change are very small and highly manageable by Western society. And in those cases, what I try to do is try and find out what it is that is driving the sense that the potentially utterly disastrous changes that will take place to the world's environment are manageable. That's not often a very productive discussion, but I think it's important to recognize that it is possible, as we're seeing with the current problem, that the proposed solution is more difficult than just simply living with the problem. Please, I don't want to get into the question of whether we should be more locked down or less locked down, but you can see there is potentially a debate there. And there's the same sort of debate about climate change, with the following exception. The problem with climate change is that the effects of it are already being felt most dramatically in the poorest parts of the world. We in the UK can cope, and in certain ways it might improve warmer winters, for example, so less cold in the house. But for the majority of the world's population, this is a disaster in the making. I think in trying to answer this question as specifically as I can, I try to move to the questions of how people in Bangladesh are going to cope with rising sea levels, how people in the hottest parts of India are going to be able to cope with temperatures that no human being can live with, and so on and so forth, to try and to get to people who are comfortable with the idea of climate change in the UK, recognizing that actually this is an unbelievably difficult problem for large parts of the world's tropical population to deal with.
Right, so you're asking people to be a little less self-centered in their approach and see if that helps them think a little more widely, really.
Well, to recognise this is a genuinely global problem, that the UK's emissions are affecting the lives of people in the poorest parts of the world. Everybody's got a responsibility. We as individuals have got a responsibility. All Western societies, all societies that emit to the atmosphere are responsible. This is a molecule of CO2 doesn't matter where the molecule of CO2 is emitted, it still has the same warming effect. And that warming effect is predominantly at the moment most destructive in the poorer parts of the tropics.
Thank you. The next question is, we live on an island. Why not use tidal and wave power?
Well, big developments there over the last few years. There is the world's biggest and best tidal power installation off the northeast coast of Scotland, the Maygen project. That has as the questioner no doubt realizes, that is pretty much the best tidal current energy stream in the world. We also have a big tidal range across most of the west of the UK, with the Severn Estuary being the best example, and we can work on that. Now, why aren't those, there are, as people probably know, plans to put a lagoon around Swansea Bay to collect energy from the fall and rise of the tide. Not going forward yet, too expensive, government refuses to back. Tidal energy off the north coast of Scotland, very, very heavily subsidised. It's not economic compared to offshore wind or onshore wind at the moment. Big advantage, of course, it is highly predictable, centuries in advance. But nevertheless, as the price of solar and wind comes down every month, it seems, it's very difficult to see how tidal could be cost competitive. And the problem with wave, the last thing I'd say is, yes, we also have some areas of good wave strength, but in order to resist the very strongest waves, wave machines, unless they've got an interesting and innovative design, have to be huge, extremely strong, very large pieces of steel. That makes them very expensive as well. So yeah, we need to continue working on it, but at the moment, these are not cost competitive technologies.
I'd quite like to follow that up with a little question of my own, because I'd heard that there were potentially ecological problems with doing some tidal power. For example, stopping the Severn Bore or mudflats for birds.
Yeah. Tidal lagoons, is the big problem of barrage right across the Severn. Tidal lagoons, such as the one that is proposed around Swansea Bay, probably don't have enormous problems. It's been heavily investigated, and almost everybody's looked at it and said it's fine. In fact, it's probably beneficial for biodiversity, but we simply don't know yet. Something to watch out, but I don't think it's probably blocked just because of that. I think we ought to be able, with tidal lagoons rather than tidal barrages, we should be able to get around that problem.
Brilliant, thanks. Next question is rather different. Isn't it extremely dangerous to store hydrogen?
Depends how it's stored. We are storing very large quantities of hydrogen today. We make 70 million tons of hydrogen, and it's stored all around the world. And I don't think there's any problem. Right, we can store it in a variety of different ways. We can compress it and put it underground into a salt cavern, for example, where it's well away from anything. We can also turn it into, we can bind it to other chemicals, whether that be nitrogen in the case of ammonia or metal hydrides in the case of more sophisticated. There are lots of different ways of storing hydrogen, not directly in gaseous form. Obviously, if we use hydrogen for heating systems, we have to put it in relatively low pressure into our gas networks. There's no avoiding that. But there's no reason to believe that that's any more dangerous than, for example, the petrol tanks that we distribute around the petrol filling stations of the world. It's a problem. It's probably solvable.
Thank you. That question came from Matt at Bristol Skeptics. And the next question is from Joe from Oxford, who asks, what incentives would you give to encourage the conversion of electric vehicles, especially to companies, landlords, councils, etc., who'd have to put in the infrastructure?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. Right. Sorry.
It's quite long, sorry. What incentives would you give to encourage conversion to electric vehicles, especially to councils and people who'd have to fund the infrastructure?
The first point I'd make is the infrastructure is coming, and it's coming quite rapidly. Charging units are being installed at a very substantial rate around the UK. I know that because until this time last year, I was chair of a company which installed charging, and then we sold out to a French multinational, and they've doubled the rate of charging since then. So the rate of charger installation. So I think the free market, as you can tell, I'm ambiguous and ambivalent about the free market, but it looks as though it's working very well in car charging installation. Right, now, at the moment, it's much more expensive to buy an electric car than to buy the equivalent petrol car. That probably is not going to be the case for more than 3 or 4 years, possibly less. I showed the example of the Volkswagen ID3 in the presentation, which is coming on sale at the end of the summer in Germany and probably will be in the UK by the end of the year. That is roughly the same price as a fossil fuel car, and you don't have to buy petrol, which saves probably the typical customer of the order of £1,000 a month, £1,000 a year. So I think some short-term incentives, particularly on smaller cars, may well be worthwhile. But for a car that's driven a long way and uses a lot of petrol, it's already economic. Now, on the question of delivery vehicles, also, on balance, now I think makes sense financially. Electricity. Perhaps people in the audience will be able to tell me I'm wrong, but it does look as though there's every logic to doing that, to switching to electricity. The issue in the long term is going to be the supply of batteries, but for the short term, I'm not certain we need a much more subsidy, apart from subsidy for smaller cars, where the advantages of electric tend to be less marked than large cars.
Thanks. That's for the owners. I have to say, as the owner of the proud owner of an electric vehicle, I think the sense of smug sense of self-satisfaction that you have is probably the best reward you can have. What about
people don't hear you coming? I tell you, it's absolutely terrifying. You must have this
stealth mode. When I don't think I'm the best of drivers, and I have this stealth mode. It is dangerous. Yes.
it really does cut your speed in urban areas because you're terrified that people are going to walk out in the road because you're making so little noise. So that's a big plus point as well.
Do you think that councils and landlords and business owners need incentives, or do you think that they will just follow what they decide is good for them?
I think, as I say, we until a year ago, I was chair of a company that installed these things, and looking at the economics, I see no reason to believe that any subsidy is needed for the installation of them.
Right. Thanks.
There's a gold rush going on. There's as many as possible, and the obvious place where they should be installed are places like supermarket car parks, where people have to be for 40 minutes. It takes roughly 40 minutes to charge up a car. From close to empty to close to full. And there's a very strong financial incentive on the likes of the supermarket chains to install charging equipment in their car parks.
So moving on, we have another question from Joe from Oxford Skeptics in the Pub, who asks, what are the most exciting developments in energy storage so that the excess of electricity can be used later?
I get awfully excited about hydrogen. I'm sorry, this may have been apparent. The fact that all of a sudden around the world, not in the UK, but in many places around the world, there is now a realization that this could be the missing ingredient which makes full decarbonisation possible. Hasn't quite hit the UK yet, it's coming, but in places like the Netherlands and to a certain extent Germany, it is assumed that the future consists of renewables plus hydrogen. We just have to persuade policymakers here that the same thing is true of the UK. Doubly true because of our resources of offshore wind.
Thanks. The next question is from Dave the Drummer. He asks, is taking carbon out of the atmosphere directly a realistic option in the timescales we have, in addition to reducing the amount emitted?
I showed a couple of early plants for extracting carbon dioxide from the air in the slides. There are only 7 or 8 around the world today, but they're highly modular. They can be scaled. If we decided as a global society to invest in carbon capture through direct capture from the atmosphere, we could do it in a very short period of time. But if we go to we then have to decide what to do with it. We can then store it underground, and one of the slides I didn't show was carbon dioxide being stored underground in Iceland, actually by combining it with basalt rock. Carbon dioxide reacts quickly with basalt. It's absorbed forever. The rock changes as a result. That is perfectly valid for large parts of the world. That's the best way of dealing with the carbon. But we also need carbon for those synthetic fuels that I was talking about to power our airplanes and things like that.
I'm feeling more optimistic the more you talk. And the next question's from Anonymous, who asks, would it be more efficient and realistic to produce electrical energy from nuclear power and convert to hydrogen the excess for use in fuel cells, cars, etc.?
Well, there is actually a very large-scale experiment going on in the United States with a nuclear-powered power station, which is in an area where renewables are growing very fast, so it's often not needed. But you can't, in general, turn a nuclear power station up and down quickly. The French nuclear power stations can to a limited extent. We can't really do that in the UK to anything like the same extent. So yes, there might be an argument for converting nuclear output into hydrogen when we've got too much electricity on the grid. That might well work in the UK. The arguments against new nuclear power stations are, I'm afraid, economic. It's approximately 3 times the price of onshore wind. Why would we do it? The only reason we do it is to avoid the intermittency problem. What my suggestion in the book is that we avoid the intermittency problem by building so much renewables that almost all the time we have enough electricity to go round.
Am I right in thinking that the Germans cancelled their nuclear? And did they do that? And if so, what do you think of that?
Many countries have decided to move away from existing nuclear. So the German government is gradually closing down nuclear power stations that have existed for 40 years. or more. The French government is gradually moving away from nuclear as well, even though it has the largest nuclear fleet, the largest percentage of electricity. The only places where there's significant development of nuclear power going on are Russia and China. And in each of those places, there may be other reasons for it, but nobody anymore contends that nuclear is ever going to be cheaper than solar. There are parts of the world where solar power now would be approximately 10% of the cost of the new nuclear power station that's being built at Hinkley Point in Somerset. Literally 10% of the cost. So you really have to believe that renewables the intermittency problem won't go away, to believe that nuclear is the right thing to be investing in for new power stations.
Thanks. And we have another, Anonymous has been busy because we have another question from them. Part of this I think you've already answered. Are there many drawbacks to using renewables, for instance, production of batteries? And they mention the disruption of ecosystems, which you've already alluded to.
We'll need batteries, but in my view, we need them in the UK for short-term storage, but they're never going to be enough for long-term storage. That is to say, if we have a windy week in December, we'll never be able to build enough battery capacity to store that surplus electricity so that we can use it in a quiet week in February. So, yes, batteries, the extraction of the minerals, the metals to make batteries represents a severe environmental problem. But the world is working on that. We are using less and less cobalt batteries, for example, and there are very substantial advances which are likely to take place in battery technologies, in the chemistry of batteries, which will mean that we will not need significant amounts of rare metals of any form to make them. We'll move to sulfur and other widely available chemicals as the battery source. But none of this solves the long-term problem of seasonal storage of vast surpluses of energy. I think hydrogen is the only way of doing that.
Great, thanks. The next question is from someone who signs themselves FOYGI. Is that Foy? Well, I'm not going to try. Do you think that it's just been pipped by someone else, but I will ask that question anyway. Do you think that the current situation, obviously where we are now, has been a positive or negative thing when it comes to decarbonising our economy?
It's difficult, isn't it? It's been, obviously, to all of us, the most appalling shock and threat to the way we run our lives, as well as being immensely destructive of human life. We've shown we can make dramatic changes. We've seen the advantages of some of the features of lockdown: lower pollution, more walking, less commitment to high carbon methods of transport, for example. But probably world emissions as a result of these appalling events are only going to go down by about 10% this year at most. So it hasn't had a dramatic effect on actual carbon production and it's putting into the atmosphere. So this is not, as it were, a rehearsal for decarbonisation. What it is a terrible shock and a realization. What it should be doing to us is make us realise that we have been abusing nature in so many different ways. We are now at the limit of the planet's capacity to handle our lives, and we need to go back to a simpler, more environmentally sensible method of living. But broadly speaking, I would be pessimistic about this. I don't think this is actually a rehearsal for a real decarbonisation effort.
Thanks. That's the first negative thing I think I've heard you said. This first really negative, but yeah, quite fair enough. The next question is from Jane, who asks, what would be the effect on jobs of a mass conversion to zero carbon?
I try to suggest in the book that the net impact on jobs is probably beneficial, but there are going to be huge if decarbonisation happens in approximately the sort of way I've been suggesting, there are some very large sectors which lose employment. Something like 300,000 people, for example, work in clothing retailing in the UK. I've forgotten the exact number, forgive me, but it's several hundred thousand. I'm suggesting that our patterns of clothing use, patterns of clothing purchase, which have grown more and more wasteful over the last generation, need to be changed dramatically so that we keep clothes, we repair them, we refashion them, we rebuild them, we put them properly into the circular economy. That produces jobs, but it's not the same jobs as the people working in Primark. So there is a very, very considerable cost to the transition in terms of employment. But across decarbonised economy, I think there's no reason to believe that jobs would be less available than they are at the moment. I identified on the last slide jobs in renewables, jobs in forestry, probably more jobs in food production, for example, as we move away from large-scale industrial manufacture of poor quality food towards a more localised, less meat-based diet. That's what I think should happen. Of course, it may not. But once again, for example, also in the case of local energy supply, pushing energy creation and electricity generation, for example, down to the municipal level will pull back employment out of the large cities into the smaller cities towards the periphery of the UK, which is where the globalization has had most detrimental effects over the last generation. So, quick answer, yes, there's going to be some enormous transition problems, but on balance, I think there's going to be no net loss of jobs.
Good, thank you. The next question, we go back to Joe from Oxford Skeptics in the Pub, whose question keeps fighting with somebody else for top spot, but there it is. Would it be viable, they keep popping up and down, would it be viable for sunny countries to use solar energy to power hydrogen production, then use existing oil pathways to supply it globally?
Yeah. Well, that's what Australia very much thinks it's going to do, actually. Australia is probably the best place in the world at the moment, bits of Australia to make hydrogen at low cost. Japan, Korea have said they want to buy hydrogen. So there is in fact a plan to put a pipeline from. It's very, very early stage, but it's just an illustration of what's being talked about. To put a hydrogen pipeline from the north coast of Australia right into Singapore. Very, very long pipeline. I'm not sure it'll ever take place, but it's just an illustration of the kind of replication of the existing oil distribution system with hydrogen. For the UK, we might end up buying a lot of hydrogen from Australia and other places with enormous resources of sun. But at the cost of our offshore wind is going to come down to a figure that's not that much lower once you've taken, much higher, once you've taken into account the effect of transport costs.
Right, I think we've probably got time for a couple more questions. Hydrogen, the anonymous person has asked this one. Oh, they're jumping up and down. I can't keep track of this. Hydrogen has a bad rap. Don't mention the Hindenburg. It's more explosive than methane and burns with an invisible flame. How will it go down with the public?
Right, okay. So that's right. It has the characteristics of combustion of hydrogen are very different. So we will almost certainly need to put colour into the flame. Don't think that. So that's being worked on at the moment. So we will know when the hydrogen is burning in our central heating system. The Hindenburg is always used as an example. The reason the Hindenburg went up in flames in the way it did was more to do with coating of the airship than it was the hydrogen. We're shipping vast quantities of hydrogen around the world, even today, through pipelines and elsewhere, with a very good safety record. Not perfect, but a very good safety record compared to methane. So yes, there are issues to be worried about, but is this more dangerous than the petrol, than pouring petrol at a garage into a machine which then burns it? Actually, no, we can make this at least safe.
That's a very good point. So moving on to the final question then, which is from Jonathan Reed. He asks, what is the best balance between carrot, tax credits and subsidies, versus stick, aviation fuel taxes, carbon-linked energy tariffs, incentives to do the best incentives for UK consumers?
Okay, well, I was trained as an economist, so every economist you'll ever ask will say carbon taxation is the way forward. You tax bad things. And you don't make it specific. You just, anything that produces CO2 or other greenhouse gases, you say you'll have to pay this per ton. That, I think, is the best way of doing it. The problem with subsidy systems is they tend to be abused. They tend to become subject to special interests. People argue for their own particular technology against everybody else. I think a universal carbon tax would be the world's best solution to this. I'm not saying it's going to happen. It's a long way from happening. But we need to keep that conversation going.
Well, brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I have really, really enjoyed that talk. I found it absolutely fascinating. And so have our viewers, as evidenced by the number of them who've stayed on board. We always get quite a drop-off, obviously, and people have been coming back and stayed because they were interested in what you had to say. So thank you very much. I'd just like to...
Thank you very much.
Before we completely finish, I'd just like to remind everyone that we've got Nick Brown next week. He'll be talking to us about how to spot science that doesn't add up. Thank you everyone in the audience for your participation and your interest. And can we have a really warm round of applause and a thank you very much indeed for Chris, who's given us the most fascinating talk and Q&A today. Thank you.